Hello, world. Welcome to the Springboard workshop. We have Nathaly with ourselves here. She is a top rated freelancer on Upwork, and she is an amazing developer which has the value of helping underprivileged social communities embedded in her work. Welcome, Nathaly. We're very happy to have you here. You may go ahead with the workshop. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Um, so I'll start sharing my screen, and afterwards I will introduce the presentation and myself to you guys. And thank you for having me, Paran. First of all, let me know if you're able to see my screen at the moment.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So basically, I'll talk about a Spring Boot and building REST APIs specifically with it. There are several forms or types of APIs. One of the most popular will be GraphQL, but I will be focusing on REST resources. And this workshop basically promises to introduce Spring Boot, a popular Java framework, for the practical experience of a freelancer. So I'll try not to focus too much on the concepts, but rather on the approach that you could take towards a client issue. Now, how will we approach the talk? First of all, we will talk about Spring Boot, introducing and why I care about it, context, so important concepts to keep in mind or to keep it going, when to use it and when not to use it. We will talk about a particular project that I have with a client or a version of it, and we will see what next after you get started with your Spring Boot journey. Now, to introduce myself, I'm Natalie. Basically, as Paran already mentioned, I am a GitHub campus expert representing Venezuela. I'm currently in Caracas. I also represent University of the People. I am a sophomore computer science student. I work as a freelancer. I have 3 years of experience on Upwork, and I am also a developer good volunteer. Basically, my skills, or at least the main part of them, focus on JavaScript, Python, and Java as a full stack web developer. My focus will be web development, although I have experience with mobile and data analysis, and my other focus will be software engineering and social applications. So I expect to use my technological skills and my social psychology knowledge to improve certain situations in my country. If you want to follow up or to search the version of the project that I'll be sharing, you can find me on GitHub and Twitter. And if you want more information, there I have my website. Now we will talk about a Spring Boot, or we will provide a basic introduction. First of all, why care about it? A Spring Boot, as you might already know, is a Java framework popular mainly for building microservices and REST APIs or backend frameworks, but it can power any type of web application. And the main reason why you might use Spring Boot is that it automatically configures several processes that are part of software engineering with basically annotations such as enable auto configuration, the Spring framework context, and component scanning. Now, to explain a little bit more about this configuration part, first of all, we have a framework that basically provides a flexible way to configure Java beans, which are, how to say, is a concept that encompasses components that um, acquire certain attributes or behaviors that you might want them to have. So, for example, if you have a Java class that is used for managing databases, you might want to add a repository annotation to it. And this will mean that this class will acquire or will be treated by the Spring Boot framework in a different way or for certain purposes. And it also handles HTML configurations, database transactions, database connections. It has a rich REST support, so integrated classes and dependencies to simplify HTTP protocols that will require a lot of more of code with core Java. It is annotation based, so you can simplify or use shortcuts to let the system understand what you need. What do I mean by this is that basically it's like using a nickname for a behavior that you need the system to understand. It's like saying to your friend, hey, like using a shortcut with your friend, like saying, Natalie, I need you to do the laundry. And by saying that exact phrase, Natalie or your friend understands what you mean and what she needs to do, the protocol that she needs to take. Is the same with Spring Boot. You basically specify an annotation such as cross origin or RAS response, and Java understands what you mean. Then we have dependency management. Um, Even though it is a framework and we know that this means it has several restrictions or it assumes certain patterns that you cannot go out of, it also allows you to integrate different patterns and libraries with via Maven, just like you will do with Python with requirements, with the requirements file. So it's really flexible in that regards. Regarding the fact that even though it does have several solutions for their problems, it also allows you to integrate any solution via dependencies. And we have an embedded container. Usually with a Java application, we will need to do a lot of configuration and to also understand certain principles of networking to get the application running. With a Spring Boot, you automatically, even if you don't specify it, you have a Tomcat server as a default. And when you run the main class or the class that's annotated with a specific annotation that I'll show you later, um, it's just exposing those resources to your server, and you can simply go to the local host port, for example. Now, some concepts to keep in mind to get it right. First of all, since we're focusing on REST APIs specifically, you will need to understand from my point of view the REST pattern. So how to build endpoints and expose resources so that your application or their system, in this case your Java application, can work both as a HTTP client, so make requests to another server, and as an HTTP server, so receive requests from another system. Then you will need to understand auto configuration in a Spring Boot and component scanning. So how is the system interconnected and why and when to use a bin? And why is it important to use this? Again, Spring Boot does abstract a lot of context for you. So, for example, with containerization or with testing, sometimes you really don't know what's going on afterwards or what's going on the back end of the application. And this is fine as long as you're building something small or something quick or something too standard, such as a sign up application. But once you start building an enterprise level app, you want to understand how to tell Spring Boot what to do, those annotations, and why something might not work with the auto configuration. Now we also have in annotations. Basically, this is a sort of language or to use certain phrases or words shortcuts that mean something to Spring Boot, and you need to understand how to communicate this with being annotations. We will talk about examples of this later on. Now we have data persistence with GPA and Hibernate. Basically, GPA is an API for Java and is for object relational mappings and for managing persistent objects, or in general, just object relational mapping. And what I mean by this is that it's basically GPA provides a way for you to communicate to the database without having to write native, for example, SQL, without having to use native SQL syntax such as select this row from table Y. So it's a Java way or language for communicating to the database, and it also provides several methods for database management and proper ways to deal with the database as well. Then we have template engines and the MVC pattern. So with template engines, mostly we will be talking about TimeLeaf. TimeLeaf is, well, a template engine that allows the Java developer to pass Java arguments or to communicate in Java in a very clean and organized ways without having to have this weird communication between Java and JavaScript. So it's a way to basically combine Java or the backend with the front end simply. And then the MVC pattern or the model view controller pattern is one of the most common ways of dealing with Spring Boot applications that use TimeLeaf. And these two are important because it basically shows you how the backend communicates with the front end in a Spring Boot. Now, when to use and when not to use. This is mostly from my perspective. I was thinking about comparing this with Django or with Flask, for example, for Python, or for with Node.js with JavaScript. But I personally think that by having the pros and cons of the framework, you'll get a better idea, and I won't have to be as objective when talking about my experience with the three frameworks. So, from my personal experience, when you have standard practices and business logic as a priority, so you have to bootstrap a prototype at the enterprise level. So even though it's a prototype, it does have to follow a strict guidelines or a strict software engineering patterns, but you need to focus on the business logic. I personally think that Spring Boot, because of the characteristics that we previously mentioned, provides the amount of abstraction that you need to develop enterprise level code rapidly. And I have an issue here, a bug. And so another is it handles software engineering issues that when you're not a full stack web developer or when you're starting as a full stack web developer, this might come as a big issue, such as security, communication with the backend to the front end, or in general using templates or having a standard template for something quick, common protocols with client server communication, and containerization, for example, with Tomcat. Now, when to avoid. Um, Even though it does have a rich it's a rich tool for the backend development, and for the front end it's a great integration, it doesn't provide any rich framework for building good user interface. And if you see a job postings, you will notice that it's when they're looking for a full stack web developer, you'll often see that if you see Spring Boot or Micronaut, and Spring Boot is often paired with AngularJS or React.js for building the front end components instead of using TimeLeaf. And this is because even though TimeLeaf is great for parsing the variables and for a standard application or a simple UI interface, is not as flexible or as rich or beautiful as you might have it with React.js. Now, the good news is that frameworks like React.js for the front end are language agnostic, at least with REST endpoints, which means you can basically work with the Spring Boot API, and you don't need to worry about the about how compatible the two are, since React.js will only mind the address or the REST endpoint that you're using for your API. And another issue is that even though it promotes dependency injection, as I mentioned before, so it's really flexible with adding or using different solutions via Maven dependencies. It does provide also or puts a lot of emphasis on the framework, and this is just natural. But I think with the Spring Boot, it goes a bit further. So your project becomes really dependable, and it's hard to migrate or translate to a non-Spring ecosystem. For example, with the Spring Boot and with the Spring in general, you have an annotation, which again is like a shortcut or a language that you use with the Spring Boot to let it know what to do with the class, for example. With the cross origin annotation, you're basically telling Spring Boot that you would like the particular class to be accessible via cross origin, how to say, connections, meaning even if the connection is not authenticated or secure, even if it's just HTTP and not HTTPS, so the connection is not secure, you want to accept it from any endpoint. Without that annotation, you will have to build the configuration in a very different way or from scratch. Which, if you're migrating the project to a non Spring ecosystem or to something that's not like Micronaut, to a similar framework, then you'll have to change a lot of about your project, especially because Spring Boot takes a lot of care about the configuration, and it does have a lot of abstraction in this sense. Um, so this will be all about the presentation with the Spring Boot, and that specific. Now we will talk about the project. Baron, let me know if there's anything else you like me to do before I go with the project.
No, no, you may proceed.
Perfect. Um, First of all, we will talk about the real case scenario that we have with the client, and then we will talk about a simplified solution or a small version of the same project. For this, we need to understand a bit more about the requirements, the project requirements. Okay, so the issue at hand for the list of requirements for the specific project that we have with our particular client is that basically we should connect the Accus Docker, a time tracking application to the Jira management system to track time and import issues information and project information, project data, user data to CodeSocker. So that the employees or the employer in this case can in a sense use CodeSocker to track the project from a financial perspective, so they can take care of the financial management part from CodeSocker, and from Jira they can take care of the project management side of the project. Just to show you how quickly how Jira works, in case you're not familiar with it, or how will the project translate. And so in Jira, to summarize everything, we have just as with Trello several boards, and we have for boards for each board, which is like a workspace for a space, the space of a particular project. We have several lists, and among those lists, we can have to do or items that are to do in a project, items that are in progress, and items that are completed, as well as another possible or other possible lists such as review, in review, or documentation. And in each project, you can have an item, which in Jira is called an issue. And an issue has several attributes, but we will only mind the Jira task name, the description, and the details about it, such as the person assigned, the labels, string, etc. So what the project requires is that we in here add a time tracking process. So we start tracking on a task when we work on it. We start tracking, and then this process will be reflected on the time tracking tool, which will be in this case CodeLocker. Just to show you, so that when we start tracking, these changes will be reflected on CodeLocker, and we will also export or send certain details about the task, such as the task name, the assigning, the labels, the description. And when we stop tracking, these changes will be reflected on the CodeLocker backend or administration. Why will we want to do this? So that the client desiring to create this project can manage the project and from CodeLocker, and specifically so that they can manage the financial part of it, because these particular financial attributes are not managed by Jira or are not attributes or functionalities that Jira has. And basically, when we start tracking from, imagine we have a button in here and we start tracking, and it will show the timer. So it will show 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds for this particular issue. And in here, we will also be able to see the Jira task name as the description of the task. Sorry, this is the project associated, the CodeLocker project associated to the Jira project, the description of the task, and the seconds that we have. And in essence, as you see in here, if you go to another tab, you'll see that it's tracking in here, and it should be reflecting also the time in here. Any other details is that an example integration will be the toggle sync for those who know about this one. And we don't have anything else to share about this particular. The following is expected from the client or for the project. We will need an authentication between CodeLocker and Jira, of course, so that CodeLocker allows access from Jira and allows the Jira instance to edit, for example, by adding a task. We have to connect Jira projects to CodeLocker projects, so CodeLocker knows which Jira project is associated with CodeLocker. We have to add a button to start tracking and stop tracking. When we click and stop, then it will stop and stop in CodeLocker. And this is a one-way connection, in the sense that we are minding, for the most part, the Jira part, or Jira sending as a client the information or the data to CodeLocker, not CodeLocker to Jira. Now, we created a similar version of the project that I can actually share with you. And we will be, but the implementation is different. So what's the solution in this case? As opposed to time tracking and connecting projects and users to from one system to another, we will be actually using Trello and Jira Communication as opposed to CodeLocker and Jira Communication, so that we can export the details from Jira to Trello and create a Trello car, which will be the equivalent to a Jira issue. And we will do that by clicking on a button as well. Now let's talk a bit about the project, about the resources that we need to keep in mind, and about the general requirements. In here, we will not address the system engineering process or the document that contains the software engineering process, since we don't. I will not like to take that much of the time, but we will try to be as specific as possible or to provide practical or simple examples with Springboard while checking the project. Now, what do we need to build our solution? First of all, we need a button. For the front end part, we need in here to add a button so that when we click, we are able to explore certain Jira details or the details of the task to Trello. And for those who are not familiar with Trello, I will basically introduce it to you. It's very similar to Jira, just a simpler version. In here, we have a board, which is a sort of space for managing a project and contains project details. In here, we have several lists. Usually, we have a to-do list, which is for items that are to be done. We have a doing or in progress tab, which is for items that are, for example, developers are working on. We have a done, which is for explicitly telling that something is completed or an item, a task is completed. And we usually have a review or feedback tab, which is for the person responsible or the supervisor of the project manager, to check and assure that the task indeed was completed successfully and that there's nothing else to add. And the input values will be, and the task details, we will just retrieve the Jira name, and the output will be a Trello card, which will include the Jira name. Sorry, the Jira details that we exported via API communication. Now, the resources that we need to use. First of all, we need a way to establish a communication between Jira and Trello, because those are two independent systems that do not know each other. And the only way to do that, at least as far as I am concerned, is via API communication. API communication, in short, to simplify things, is a process or protocol that allows the systems to communicate via HTTP protocols, and specifically with REST applications with REST resources. Basically, one application acts as the client, which is a synonym for the requester, the user requesting a resource or information data, essentially. And the other side is the server, and the server is a provider or the supplier. So is the person responding to the request, to the usually requested data that the client or the requester is asking for. In this case, we have a one-way communication between Jira and Trello. We have Jira as the we actually we will have in a sense it will be a third there will be a third party, because we will be developing an API application that will allow Jira to communicate with Trello. What are the resources that we will need? First of all, we will use the Trello REST API to create a new card. We will be using the endpoint create a new card, which will have a post method, and this is the endpoint that we will need with the base URL. Now, with that being said, we know that we have a post method, which is similar to inserting the insert command for a SQL database. And we will have the following parameters, the following query parameters, which are details that you can add to your object to create the car, the Trello car. The only one that's required is a ID list, which, by the way, sorry, the ID list is the ID or the unique identifier of this particular item, which is the list imported. And then we need to also use the Connect JavaScript API, sorry, the Jira Rust API, to get the issue details. Why do we need this? This is for getting the data that we will send to Trello. For example, if we need to send the name, the property that we will have to target will be the summary of the project. Let's see if we can find it in here. If we have, this is by the way the JSON response from the see if we can find it. So apparently we are not finding the attribute that we need, which will be the summary. The description. Well, could be the description. We will have to figure it out as we move forward with the class. And so for the side of the Jira application or the Jira REST API, we'll have to make a call to get the issue to get the issue details, which will be with a get method, which will be equivalent to using the select command with SQL. We will specify the issue that we need, the ID of the issue, and then we will have a JSON response with all the information about the task. And finally, something to keep in mind is that usually with APIs that are external or that are publicly available, we have to authenticate ourselves, which means we need to provide a password or a token that give the API permission to update any resource of a particular instance or system. Why? Because we basically need to give the application permission to touch sensitive information or touch something that we might not or might want to edit, so that not everyone can have access to our, for example, workspace or Trello account. In short, authentication and authorization. Authenticating means you are letting the application know that you are the user you claim to be, that you are the user, for example, who owns the Trello board, who owns the Trello workspace. Authorization is after authenticating yourself. It's saying, okay, Jazz, I am the owner and I give you, on top of things, permission to update the resources or to touch or modify this particular account. Sorry for the background noise. So now let's go about the project. This is the standard. Usually this is a standard structure of a Springboard project. We have the C main Java and the resources folder. The most important way to track dependencies is the POM file, which is managed by Maven. And in here we have, superficially looking at them, a group of, first of all, we have the information about our artifact or about the application. This is useful for creating a jar file or for creating an executable version of your project. Then we have the most important aspect of this, which will be the dependencies. We're using this dependency called the Springboard Starter Web Application. Is the a dependency that basically contains all the functionalities that we will need for the base Spring Boot app. Then we have, this is also a standard for Connect Spring Boot. These are standard libraries that we need to use for the Spring framework. Then we have Gpa, which again is an API for usually dealing with data persistence and databases for your application. With Gpa and Hibernate, you use object relational mapping, which means you use Java objects to translate or to communicate with SQL language or the SQL database if you're using a relational database. And then we have the template engine, which is TimeLeaf. I'll show you an example how TimeLeaf works. This is also for TimeLeaf, nothing specific here. We're using an additional dependency that's not native to Spring Boot, which is called Uniras. This is just for making HTTP requests easily. And then we have additional plugins. In this particular file, you will add dependencies that you need. So for example, if you plan to use PostgreSQL, usually you will need to configure this in a file, or you will need to take a care of the configuration. However, without dependency, you simply add, for example, the dependency corresponding to the PostgreSQL manager. PostgreSQL is a relational database, and then Spring Boot takes the information that's part of that dependency and assumes several defaults of the configuration. Then we have the standard structure of the project. We have the two main folders, the folder with the main classes and the folders with the resources. Here we will always, in a Spring Boot application, we will always have the main class in Java application, which is annotated with a Spring Boot application. And this is assuming, with the Spring Boot annotation, we are assuming auto configuration with the components. We are enabling, again, auto configuration. And as I mentioned before, when you're using a Spring Boot annotation or an annotation in the Spring context, you are letting with a shortcut Spring Boot knows that it can assume a lot about the configuration of the project. And then we have a standard controller. When you add the controller to this, you are adding particular attributes or behaviors, and where you're adding the REST controller specifically, you are, for example, annotating. It is not necessary to add a response body to this particular method because this REST controller assumes that all the resources that you have in here or all the methods will return an HTTP response with HTTP format. The reason why I'm not using a REST controller is that sometimes I need to return a template and sometimes I need to return an HTTP response. So let's go about the specifics specifics of the file in here. Here we're using TimeLeaf, and we have an annotation for the first bar. We have an annotation here which is indicated that this particular Java method or function, if we may, it's going to accept only get requests. If you make a request via HTTP request with the endpoint TimeLeaf using the base application, so localhost slash TimeLeaf, and you use a post method, which is for inserting data, this will return an error. So basically, this annotation is indicating that this particular method will acquire the behavior or the rules of a get method for a REST application. And then in here, we're taking as a parameter a string. Sorry, we are returning the string, which even though we are indeed returning a string in here with TimeLeaf, when you are not adding the response body annotation, since we are using a template engine, which is TimeLeaf, we are basically telling that this method will return a template with the name TimeLeaf. And templates are located in the folder resources, and in here we have the names. If we add, for example, TimeLeaf T, and this does not exist, Java will assume an error because by returning a string here and not annotating it with response body, you're saying that we need to look for a template. Then we have the other method, which is a get mapping. When you hit Trello connection, it will return the Trello connection template, which is another HTML file. We will check those in a second. And then finally, we have our REST method, which means this is not expected to return an HTML file or a template. This is supposed to return a REST response or an HTTP response, which will have a status code, the body of the request, and headers, for example. And this will be used to create a Trello card. We have another class which is called Trello Service. We are using a different, basically the controller, the TimeLeaf controller, receive endpoints that are requests from the front end, if that makes sense. So the user interacts with the front end, right, with the main view, and they click on a button that will be interpreted by the application as a request that the user is making to our system. And the requests for our particular application are handled by the TimeLeaf controller. And then the controller is in charge of the business control logic. The controller is not responsible for the actual business logic or the operations that are responsible for processing our data per se. It's just responsible for commanding and taking orders. For that reason, we are using a Trello service, which is another class that will be responsible for actually managing the data or processing the data, or at least letting another entity process the data. With this particular method, we will be creating our Trello card. We are receiving to actually create a Trello card. Our API is expecting a post method or a post request, and the post request is accepting as the request body or as the argument for our method a map or a dictionary with our parameters. This map or dictionary will actually be a JSON and will be translated to map. And we will be sending basically for the map or for the dictionary the parameters that we will need to create the arguments that we will need to create our Trello card. Now the Trello service is having a create card method which receive a value which will be the name, and in here with that name is sending that as a parameter, as an argument for creating the card, the Trello card. In here in this particular service, we are actually making an HTTP response with the dependency that I added, which is the Uniras Java annotation, dependency. And this library or dependency basically allows us to simplify the making the request process. We have that we are making in here a post request. In here we're specifying the base URL that we need to make the request. Then we're adding as a header that we need to asset JSON. We can asset application JSON format. We are adding as a query string the name of the task. In this case, we're hard coding it, but we will be replacing this in a second. And then we have to specify the ID list of the unique identifier of the list on Trello that we need. And then we are specifying the tokens for authentication. Normally, you will have a header with authorization. So it will be header. Let's just copy this to provide an example. Normally, we will see something like this. Authorization. And here we have the token or the password that we use for making the request and for letting the API know that we are the user we say we are. This is similar. A token is similar to a password and is used for authenticating the user making the request. And but in this case, we are passing it as an argument or as a query string, and we're passing the key, the Trello key that we generated. You have to generate this from Trello. We will not cover this at the moment, but basically it's a key that you go to a specific settings of Trello and you click on a button and it generates the password, the token for you, and the key. And then we also pass the token, which is another way or is another part of the authentication process. And then we say, whatever they respond, please parse it as JSON. So I want the response that the server gets, give me, I want it to transform it to JSON. And then once we get the response, the HTTP response, we start the JSON node and we get the body, which is the content or the actual response that we got. We show the status code, which in a HTTP response, the status code is for telling the developer how the connection went via a code. It's a code that means something. We will talk about it later. And then we're also showing or logging to the console to follow or debug the application. We are logging the actual response, so the content that we receive. And finally, we are returning the HTTP response, which it's a response entity which contains a status code equals to 200, which is it's equivalent to OK. OK means that everything was right, was correct, that everything went well with the connection. We are passing as our request body for the response, the content of the response we got. So basically, we for this method for creating a Trello card, we are making an API request to the Trello API, and then once we get the response, we are formatting this and passing it back to our controller so that the controller has something to return to the front end. Now let's check the front end. Let's go about it quickly. We have a layout. This is just a fragment that we attach to actual templates, which means we are inserting this head in an actual HTML template with HTML. Let's see how this will work. In here, we're adding TimeLeaf, a template engine that, in short, it's a library that allows you to mix or to communicate to make the communication process between the backend, which is Java, the Java side of things, and the front end, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, easier by using parsing or by using a language that allows you to insert variables. For example, in this case, we have the head of a normal HTML body, HTML file, and in the head, we with TimeLeaf are inserting another HTML, which means this head with HTML will simply replace this with this block, which means we have access to the script or to certain resources that we need. Why are we doing this instead of simply inserting the layout several times? We have to use the layouts with almost all templates. So the process of inserting it with TimeLeaf is easier than just copying and pasting. And also, since if we affect this particular file, the changes will be reflected in each one that had TimeLeaf inserted in it, as opposed to having a different version for each. We will need to edit each one of them. Now, for the body, we are using the Atlassian UI framework. I will explain this later. It's similar to the Bootstrap framework for UI. It's just that this is a standard for building Atlassian applications. And since this will be used by Jira, by the Atlassian instance, which is attached to Jira, we cannot install the application without using their framework for styling elements. We have a section, we have the header with a simple TimeLeaf title, with a simple string, and then we have in here another section with a simple div that says hello, and with TimeLeaf is inserting an attribute that's from the backend. So this is an example of what you will do with TimeLeaf without necessarily having to use JavaScript to insert this value to the span. And here I'm saying the text of this span to be the value of this particular variable. So the object authentication dot principal give me the user account ID of the principal user, which is currently log in and display it. So this will display the user ID. And finally, we have the most complicated file, which will be the Trello connection file. In here, we are, to summarize, we have a div, we have a header with just titles or information about the functionality using Learning Dixon. And then this is the main part. We have a button, and when you click on this button, you are supposed to when you click on this button on Jira, you're supposed to let the system know that you want to create a Trello card via API. Finally, in here we're saying with JavaScript, if we click on the Export Jira Data button, which has the identifier Trello export, if we receive a click from the client, I want you to say to the console this, we're exporting Jira details, create a flag, which is a notification, a pop-up that says, okay, we received the request. Then we want to make an Ajax request to let the backend, which will be Spring Boot, our controller, know that we want to create um, a Trello card. When we hit this button, we are in here. We are supposed to extract the parameters via the Jira API, and then with the Ajax request, we are making a pause. We're hitting this. Let me show you. We're communicating with this controller, and if you see, we have the endpoint Trello car, right? In here, Trello car. So that's the URL. When we hit that URL, when we specify that URL, we're saying that we want to target this particular method. And with this, we are saying, okay, the type of method will be a post, again, because it could be post, put, get, and post is for inserting data or for sending data. And we want the content type to be JSON, although here we are also specifying a format for URL. The data type that we want to receive and send will also be JSON, and we're sending as a request body, which will be this particular argument. Well, in here is our parameter, which will be this particular parameter or requirement um, here. So we're sending this JSON object to Java, which is receiving it as a map to create our Trello card. And finally, if everything goes well, we are showing the result or the response body, and we are creating a notification, a pop-up to let the client know, okay, you created your Trello card, everything was fine. If nothing goes well, if something goes wrong, or if anything goes wrong, we are just console.log. Showing this to the console, the client won't know that something went wrong. This is to make the project simple. Usually we will have exception handling or different ways of solving the error or doing something about the error. For this, we're just caching it or recognizing that there could be an error and just console.log or showing that to the console. Now let's implement the project. Let's run the project and let's see how it looks, and then let's fix some parts of it. When we're running a Springboard application, automatically Java will know that it's the one that's annotated with the Springboard application. In fact, you can see here at the top of the console that it's running the add-on application class that's annotated with the Springboard application. It's logging certain details about how everything works or how everything is going. The only thing that you will mind at this point of the process will be that the Tomcat server initialize on port 8080. So if you hit localhost 8080, you see that there is a running application in there. If this was not running, then you'll see not found. The other things you can keep an eye on them. It is important that you understand them. But if you're already familiar with what's going on as a developer, you won't be always seeing the general input unless it's debugging or unless there is an error or warning. Now the application is running. We need to expose it. First of all, I'll show you what we need to do. With Jira, there are several ways of installing an add-on or an external application. One way will be to install it via the Atlassian Marketplace, which is similar to Google Play. It's just a place for installing add-ons or applications, extensions that belong to the Atlassian environment. Or you will go to this, for example, or you can do it in a debugging or development way when the application is not published to the Atlassian marketplace, when you're just testing it, for example. In here, we need to enter the URL to our app so Jira can basically extract or download the resources that we need and install the app or install those resources to our Jira instance. Because because this is a local application and we are not connected, the application in particular is not really connected to the internet. We're running it on local hosts. There is no way for Jira to access those resources. So if we provide this URL, Jira won't be able to download the resources from our computer and then run the app. Why? We're running it locally. We're not exposing this to the internet via Heroku or Vercel. We have not deployed the application. For that reason, we will use a library or a tool called Engrow. Sorry, this was not. And what Engrow does is that it's basically just a tool that you specify the endpoint or the port. Sorry, you specify the port, and it will expose your resources temporarily to the web in a way that's safe. It's safe to do this. And this is temporarily, as long as you're running the application. So instead of having a local host or the host address of your server, you're having this server that is basically exposing your resources, specific resources, the resources, your application to Jira. And now we will use this and we will replace it in the application YAML file. And then the Atlassian Connect file, which is a configuration that I have to explain to you that we are using also the Atlassian Connect framework, but this is just a file that allows Jira to know what configuration to use for our project. Why? Because with the Springboard, we are also adding a new dependency or another dependency, which is a framework that Jira, the Atlassian development team created for Springboard specifically, and it's called the Atlassian Connect Springboard. The Atlassian Connect Springboard framework, which is composed by these two dependencies. And these are simply a set of libraries that helps us follow the guidelines by the Atlassian Marketplace. And one of those is that we require a document that specifies certain things about our application. In here, just to go shallow about this, and to keep it short, we have the key, which is just the identifier for our application. We have a base URL, which is the URL that Jira will use to download our resources. We have the name of the application, which will be used for clients to know the name, the authentication type that you're using, and general configurations for showing a specific modules and for showing a specific sort of components in parts of the Jira application. We'll go about those later. Now, once we have our URL that Engrow created for us to expose our resources, we will upload it via this. There was an unexpected error. Let us check if there's anything. Let us refresh. Okay. Sometimes you might get an unexpected error. I will not panic if it's just an error occurs. Sometimes it is just a 500 server error, which means it's not your application. Is that maybe they could not download the resources on time or something happened from their side. Here we have our application, which means the application was installed successfully, and we can see in your apps that the application is in there. And we're just showing the template that we have, the HTML template that I just showed you. In here, as you can see, at the top, we are specifying certain information. We're giving certain information, generate information about our app, Digital. But in here, we're saying that the modules that we want to touch of Jira specifically will be the one that's located at the system top navigation bar. This one. This is how we create the time leaf. This is how we create this button, basically. And as you can see, this is the value. If I change, I'm not sure if it will be reflected, but if I change the value in here, and the Jira is receiving our changes to be reflected. And then the other part of Jira that we are affecting is we're saying, give me a page for a particular page that should be located at the system header left, and I want you to display the time leaf template, which is the template that we're displaying is this. And as you can see at the top, we have a header, which is time leaf sample, and then we have the user ID in here. It's not updated, but this will correspond to this value in essence. If it's not updating, this could mean that you need to reinstall the application. Some changes will be reflected automatically, some changes will not. And when you need those that will not to display immediately, you need to reinstall the application. And the other part of the front end that was affected was the issue. I think the issue, the Jira issue. As you can see, we have a Trello connection new button in here. How did we add this? Well, we to add something to the issue, we simply add this particular attribute, Jira issue glances, which is an array, and we specify the icon that we will use, which is the image Trello. This is immediately targeting, again, a Spring Boot in here with this relative path is saying, okay, when I have image and Trello.png, it has to be located in CRC main resources, the static file image. And in here, it looks for it. This is an automatic configuration that the Spring Boot takes care of. And all resources of this kind, JavaScript and image resources and CSS files, needs to be located under static and under the resources folder for this to be fetched. And this is the icon that we are using for this. And then we have the value for the button, which is a supporter Trello board. And in here, we're saying, okay, once the user clicks on this button, I want you to use the Trello connection template. Again, Spring Boot assumes that this Trello connection relative path is a template, a time leaf template that's under this folder, under templates folder. and it's actually this Trello connection.html. And finally, here we're just specifying some generic information that for this particular example is not relevant. If we check the Trello connection file, we'll see that we have a section, and in here we're specifying some description with loading and tasks, and here we have our button, which is this button. And when I click on this, we will trigger this particular function. First, we are saying receiving your request, and then we immediately created your Trello card. This means one, we received it, and second, it was successful. And if we check what's going on the backend, we have to click, or actually we have to refresh since it's not, it did not get the information about the request. When we need to check what we're sending to the backend via the front end, we have this development tool, and we go to the network tab, and we see our endpoint. So for example, if we click on here, we see that this was triggered, and it actually has the URL that we use for our Ajax method, our Ajax call, sorry. And if we click on this, we'll see that the response, that the information that we sent, the request value was this: name null, string null. This was a JSON body that was received by our controller as a map. And the response that we received was the JSON body of the response request from the call to the Trello API. Which means, in other words, we send a request, right? And then this is saying, okay, Trello service, I need you to create a Trello card, make an API call to the Trello API. Here we make the call to the Trello API. Everything was successful, and then we're sending the body of this response. And if we check in here, in this particular 2 lines, we'll see that we are indeed receiving a request to create a Trello card. Then we created the response that we received was 200, which means okay, everything was successful. We're able to create the card, and here we're receiving the JSON node, which means our Trello card was created in here. If we change, here we are using hard-coded strings. We're not using the actual Jira name. The actual Jira issue name, we will change that in a second. If we change in here the name that we're passing, and we click again, we should have in here another result, different result. Which is example task 223, sorry. Now, what we will do for as just an example, or as an exercise, will be to actually retrieve the Jira issue name or summary of the task, of the Jira task or issue, and then pass that as a parameter, and then actually use that for our API call. Now, Paran, let me know if if the audience has any questions, or if you need me to do something in particular before.
Looks like we don't have any questions so far, so you may continue.
Perfect. So now, what do we need to create what do we need to retrieve the actual Trello issue ID, which will be this? Let's change it to something else. example task Trello. We for this need to make an API call to the Jira Cloud Platform REST API to get the issue details of this particular issue. And we know that in order for us to do that, we can use a get method, and then we use as the base URL this one, the host URL of the instance, the person making the call, and then we add the endpoint with the issue ID or key. And this will return the JSON body, which ideally should be able to find the actual summary, which I can't seem to find yet. Now to test that how the endpoint works, let's actually make the call via a normal browser call. You will need to see if we have an example in here already. Myself, projects. I do have in here. No, this will not be. Let's see if we. Okay, here is an example. But this is a different call. We are in here retrieving for a different resource. Now, as we know, the base URL will be the Jira instance of the host URL or the address of the Jira instance. You will go to your workspace and will copy the base URL. And then you will add the endpoint specified by the REST API, which will be this. You copy and paste this. And in here, this is a query string argument, which means you are supposed to replace this with an actual value because it will be taken as an argument for a method. Now in here, we will replace it with the issue ID. And the issue ID or the issue key is this. If I'm not mistaken, it's this. Okay. And here we are supposedly receiving the details of our issue. And if we see, it has a key corresponding to our issue, and we should be able to find the description or the summary, which is the issue name. Okay, so it's this one. What do we want from all of this for this JSON response, which is an object, a JSON object? We want to just retrieve the summary or the Jira task name. In this case, it's example task for Trello. We can change that and see the changes reflected. You see that in here it's now example task for Trello too. Skip it. Simple. To do so, we will need to understand the levels of the object, of the JSON object. But first of all, we will need to make the call. How we will make the call? With another tool that Jira has for us, which is the Connect JavaScript API. This is just a library that allows you as a developer to make API calls to the REST Jira API without having to use the backend, just using JavaScript. In a way that's simple, that's safe. You do not need to authenticate your request, this is automatically done by the API. And here we go to the tab that specifies how to make a request. Again, ideally, we will have success, the success function, and the error function. We need to handle the error and to understand what to do if something goes wrong. Since this is an example, we will just include the success standard format. We will paste it in here. This is for retrieving the name or the summary. And the tool, the API Connect tool that they have for us, that they have for developers, automatically gets the Atlassian instance connected to the project. Why? Because even though we're running this from localhost and it's not directly able to identify the Atlassian instance, we are still using the dependency that they provide, the dependency the Jira dependency for sorry, the Atlassian dependency for Springboard applications, which is in the POM file, which under the hood is letting the application, the API, know which instance to use. For that reason, we can simply keep it with a relative path without having to specify the full URL. And this means that this will work for any Jira instance, not only for mine. And now we copy and paste this, which is the endpoint that we need. In here, we are hard coding this, but we don't want to hard code the actual issue ID. Why? If we go to a different Jira issue, not only this one, but if we go to another issue, we want to make sure that we actually have the ID of the other Jira issue. We don't want to always have information for this one. But this requires you to use a different part of the tool. And for now, to demonstrate this, the ap.request, we will go with the hard-coded string, and then if we're, well, actually we have time for this. And then after it, we will, since we still have, we don't have 1 hour, we've not been communicated for 1 hour, that we can simply replace this with the actual string. Now, once the request is successful, okay, we can actually, instead of using this, just show this to the console to follow for debugging purposes. Say to the console of the browser. If the request was successful, we want to parse the JSON body, and so it was JSON.parse. We want to be able to manipulate it in a way that we can retrieve the value that we need from it, which will be the summary. We are parsing the response task, which is just a string in this case. And from the object, if I'm not mistaken, about the levels, we will need to click on fields. We're trying to see how many nested objects we have. Because we have this main block, right, which is the JSON object, and then we have this fields array, and this fields array, object is containing our summary, which is somewhere in here. And then we want to know if summary is inside another object. we don't have, for this example, a rich way of, or an strategic way of simply going to the nested objects. We need to do it like this. We have fields, and then project, it's dependent versus priority. And then it seems like summary, it's at the level of the fields, which is great. We could also do dot parse dot fields. We can console.log this. And then we have the summary. We could also do that summary, but we can also separate it as an independent variable, and we say object just replace this with curly braces style, and then object summary. And just to follow up, we are consoling.log that as well, the summary. And and we want to set one of these attributes, just one actually, to our summary, so that when we send the Trello parameters, in this case it will be Trello arguments that on the method there are still parameters. Anyways, when we send the Trello parameters, we send the summary. For this, we actually need to create a summary variable outside of the we need to create it outside of the function, the success scope, since this if we create it in here, once we try to access the constant via this, it won't be accessible. So we want to initialize this on a it's not a global scope, but on a scope that's accessible by our Trello parents object. And then we want to initialize the summary variable with the object summary, sorry, with the inside of the function. And then at this point, we can pass how everything is going. We are actually retrieving the correct objects and values by running the application again. Okay. And the issue with, I guess, with Connect String APIs is that sometimes, at least for the changes that you make to the front end, those take some those takes more minutes than those that you make to the backend. If you make a change to the controller, for example, and not to the HTML template that I'm using, the controller will immediately send these changes to the Jira instance. However, for some reason, the HTML, the changes that you make to the HTML or the front end resources take a little bit more of time. Let's see. Let's try to refresh, anyways, on this side, the editor. It clicks and check. Okay. Let's try to see. Okay. It's actually displaying the the content, which means we successfully make a request to the JavaScript API, sorry, to the Jira REST API, and it's showing the object, the JSON body that we just parsed. However, we don't see the ID. Mm. Oh no, actually this is another response. It does not correspond to the call that we made to the API. So this was the response of the call that we made to the API to retrieve the issue data. This response corresponds Hello.
Welcome back, Nathaly. Considering the fact that we ourselves are from India, we can totally understand that such problems are normal. And don't worry about it, it's very common here. And in my past streams, when I live streamed myself, it has happened quite a couple of times. And I have even had participants wait for more than 30 minutes. So
Mm.
this was definitely better. Don't worry about it.
So I'll continue with the issue. Actually, I didn't notice that it took a
Hmm.
lot of time. So let's finish with the problems. I'll share my screen. Going back, the issue that we had to do with the fact that we were um, copying. We were using the wrong endpoint. Now we'll try to run it again by refreshing. And if the changes were reflected on the um, front end, which you'll see, let us see if those were reflected or not. Okay, so we're having a different issue here. Again, forbidden means that actually the request was successful or that the server understood but is not willing to um, fulfill it. And that's the reason why this could be happening. It's unknown. Mm. Yes, the reason why this could be happening so far, as far as I'm concerned, is to me unknown. Um, I was looking at a similar example, but REST API to second issue plus the issue key. But um, okay, it could be that we need to have the context. So we'll try adding the context to it. Okay, this is the wrong enclosing. The level of the. And now the reason why this could be throwing an error is that we will still need to read the documentation for this since I don't have the specifics about the particular issue. This is an assumption, but in some cases we have to make an API.request under the context of the tool. However, I doubt this is actually the source of the problem. We will need to debug to see if if there's an additional issue. If we are not able to solve it in the following 3 minutes, could have to end for today, and I will post the solution via the GitHub repository, explaining the issue with it. Otherwise, let's see if we have to use the context to retrieve the information. Okay, export raw data. We're still having the same issue, which is 403 forbidden. And the Jira API is not providing any specifics about the forbidden error. So for now, I think it's better to yes, for now, I think it's better to close with the project, explaining what could have happened if this had been successful. And I will provide the access to the repository or make it public and solve the error and explicitly tell the source of the issue, the README file, and contact parent to make it available as well. What do you say, parent?
Yes, that would be fine.
Mm. Yes, I'm not really sure why it's showing the forbidden issue. So, yes. Now, to finish with this, basically, we were responsible for using the AP, the JavaScript API tool, which is a library for basically making API calls via JavaScript. And in here, we're making a request via the method request. We're specifying the endpoint that we want to hit. It is a relative path because the tool is already retrieving the base URL, which is um, the URL corresponding to our Jira instance. Then, if this was successful, we will basically parse the JSON and extract get the fields object, then get from this fields object the summary field, which is basically the Jira task ID. And then we will use this particular argument as a value for our Trello parents object, and then we will pass this object with our Jira name, with the Jira task name, to the backend. Let's close this once. And in here, our controller responsible for creating the Trello card will receive these arguments, will output the arguments via login, and then we will send, instead of sending null, we will send parents.get the name, which is still null. In this case, for this particular case, since it's not working. Oh, well, actually it's not null. We set it to an empty string. And then we will use this particular argument to set on the Trello, the name for our Trello card. So instead of using this hard-coded string, we will replace it with card name. And this dynamic input will be reflected on our board, which is this one. Now, if you're able to solve the issue before I do, that's great as well, let me know. Otherwise, I will be updating the project by the next week. And that will be all from my part.
Okay, Nathalie, it was really nice having the workshop. Thank you very much. We enjoyed a lot. But now we're moving on to the Q&A part. We have lots of questions for you. And considering we don't have Java developers here very often, we'll probably have lots of questions for you. So let's move on with them. uh, right now you showed us, so before starting the Q&A, I would like to share some facts with you. So the word Jira actually refers to cumin seeds in the Indian languages. So that's an interesting fact. And another thing is, so you just uploaded the application to Jira by tunneling it using ngrok.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, once we hosted a local CTF, which we tried to run using ngrok through tunneling, and we definitely ran into a lot of bandwidth issues. We can't really host an entire competition using ngrok. When we came across Cloudflare tunnel, which is just another facility like ngrok, except it is the only free tunneling service provider that allows us to use a custom domain name. Okay.
Oh.
uh, Now we can move on to the questions. So right now we used ngrok, but let's say you were to deploy this application. You were to deploy an independent API backend server to the web. uh, if it's a Spring Boot application, what would be your preferred platform to deploy it?
Okay, it depends. If it's just a prototype, I have a strong preference for the standard or the most popular one, which is Hierarchy. However, I have a client who prefers Vercel, which is another service, and the reason for this is that he has more control over the resources as a client. So this is something to keep in mind. If you're just demonstrating the project, you might want to use something like Hierarchy. If there's something for a client and they want some sort of user interface or control, and this is your priority as well for them, then something like Vercel, which is easy as well, can be another option. And for this particular project, we're working with a company called Cold Soccer from the Czech Republic and another company from the Czech Republic. And they will this will be enabled for more than 100 users or so, which means we need more than a simple prototype for Hierarchy. We need to consider other capabilities that are more complex, such as Amazon Web Services. In short, my opinion is that you should consider what do you want to get from the server, what do you want to, at what level will your application be using those resources, and based on that, make your choice.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. I think Heroku is the primary choice for most developers learning to deploy applications. So that's the way to go for Spring Boot as well. Uh, Now, the name itself reminds us of the Spring framework, which is very abundant in Java.
Mhm.
Now we know that we can use Spring Boot to create backend server REST APIs. In addition to REST APIs, what else can we use the entire Spring framework to create? Can you give us a description?
Yes. Actually, Spring Boot in particular and the Spring framework is not only for REST APIs. It could be popular for microservices because of the rapid, um, how to say, configuration process. However, it's for web applications in general. They are, for example, yesterday I was building a command line tool, and they have several dependencies for supporting or creating command line tools such as Spring Native, which if I'm not mistaken is uses a dependency which is GraphVM or something like that for containerization and running the application outside of the Java console. So this is an example. You can use it for creating command line tools. You can also use it for web development. The only downside of it, I guess, with web development in general or web applications that are not necessarily REST applications or APIs, is that you will, for most cases, use a front end framework like AngularJS or um, React.js. Again, for what I mentioned about the restrictions with sign leaf and how
Mm-hmm.
beautiful it could look.
I agree. We'll come back to the templating engine that you mentioned because we have a question regarding that as well. So moving forward, in Java there are three major package managers that I use personally. They are Maven, Gradle, and Ant. Gradle is mostly found with Android applications, and Maven is used a lot with Spring Boot. What is your favorite package manager in Java?
Honestly speaking, my favorite is Maven. However, when it comes to performance, Gradle it's better for enterprise applications. In general, Spring Boot will be easier with Maven for adding dependencies. But again, this will come at how big is your project and how it's maybe affecting the performance of it. For my part, if it's not a requirement for the company and I don't see any restrictions with Maven, I will use it.
I see. So Maven will be your preference.
Hmm.
I would like to add that Java developers at our community who have used Gradle have struggled a lot. So they don't really like Gradle in particular. But it is there's no choice when we are using the Android Studio. So we are looking for ways there as well. Okay, moving forward. So there was an application.yml file where you specified a lot of configuration for the APIs that you were building. In Node.js and Python applications, we have the concept of .env files inside which we specify some configuration which can be used by the application dynamically because there are certain details like API keys that we don't want to commit with the application into the public repository. So, what is the Spring Boot equivalent of .env files?
You do have for Spring Boot, you have the usually there are two versions, right? This is YAML files and that um, dot properties files. So you can have the extension is either YAML or dot properties. That you can have any name for it, but usually for a Spring Boot, if it's a general configuration, you will use application dot properties. And let me quickly show you where it's located and what it looks
Mhm.
like. In a regular project configuration, you will find it under the resources file. That is in outside of folder of any folder, just under the resources file. I'm using in this case YAML, but you can use that properties. It looks like this. In here, you also have the environment variables, if you may, and you get them by using the value annotation
Mhm.
and this format or this syntax for
Mhm.
specifying the key in particular. So I'm here and saying Trello, give me the Trello key that's in the application.file, and it's retrieving this.
I see. And you were able to retrieve those values inside time leaf during the templating as well.
Oh, yes.
Okay, moving forward. So there's a very popular front-end mobile application development hybrid framework known as Flutter these days. Flutter that runs on top of Dart, the Dart programming language. So in Flutter, we have the tradition of using classes instead of independent maps for JSON inputs when we know what the incoming format is going to be. So, can we map the JSON maps string that we have to fixed schema classes in Spring Boot? So, for example, we had the summary attribute. Can we map that map into a class that has a summary attribute and the ID?
Can we map JSON? Yes. This happens from the backend to the front end and vice versa. But the JSON object needs to match the arguments of the Java object, and you will just need to specify instead of using a map parent, if instead of using a map object, a map Java object, you will specify your own class. So let me quickly show you. Um, okay. Um, in here for our time leaf controller, we are receiving a request body, which is a map object with basically um, which is having the string a string as a key, which is accepting a string as a key, and as a value is accepting a string as a string. This is the most common way or the simplest way of matching or getting a JSON object because we don't have to worry that much about the um, attributes not matching with our object. However, if you have a JSON object with name, um, age, for example, and you have a class, a Java class with those attributes, you can simply replace this with the name of your Java class. And the same goes for the returning a response.
Mm-hmm. I see. So right now we're doing the response entity with the type string. In that case, we'll put another class in place of string. Is that right?
No, in this case, you're using a map, which is equivalent to a dictionary in Python. And
Mm-hmm.
the map accepts only a string as a key, and as the value of that key, you can use a string. If
Mm-hmm.
you are using an object, if you're, for example, having a JSON object that have a name, an age, and let's say that that object could be called person, you can create a model, a Java object called person with the attributes, with a name and the age, and you'll replace it in here, like the name of your class, if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. And Spring Boot will automatically identify that it can be translated into that class's object, and we'll get an object of that class.
Exactly. That's called type conversion in a Spring Boot, where I did not talk about it, but it's possible.
Mm-hmm. I see. That is pretty convenient actually. In Node.js, we have the ability to use TypeScript, but that still doesn't allow a type conversion during runtime, which is very much feasible in Spring Boot as I just saw. So that's much better. In Python, we have a very popular framework known as Flask, and in Flask we mostly use Jinja 2 as the templating engine, but we
Mhm.
also have PML. In Node.js, we have Express as the most popular backend server, and we use EJS and Jade as the templating engines. In Spring Boot, you just showed us an example of using Timeleaf. Have you worked with other templating engines in Spring Boot?
No, actually, just Steinleaf. This is the how to say the one that's the most supported or encouraged by the Spring documentation. Usually, when they address template engines, you will almost always use Steinleaf as a default. However, if I don't use Steinleaf, I would rather have a full framework, JavaScript framework such as React.js for the building for the front end components.
I see. So, based on what discussions we had, it makes it clear that it's usually preferred to use a JavaScript framework from the front end and doing the back end exclusively using Spring Boot. Okay.
If you're yes, if you're having mostly if you're having APIs, since frameworks like React.js are language agnostic, they don't really mind if you're using Java or a Python tool as long as it's a working API. And also, it depends on how flexible, at least in my opinion, at how flexible you need the front end components to be in terms of beautifying them and having a structure or a UI framework that's such as similar to Material UI or Bootstrap.
I see. Makes sense. Moving on, we'll talk about a very prominent example in the current industry, which is WordPress. It allows us users to create blogs very easily, and people manage to create really amazing blogs without writing a single line of code. We also have Wix, which has grown to a lot of popularity, allowing people to develop websites with ease. So we have a very popular proverb that with abstraction comes lack of control. You mentioned that Spring Boot provides us with lots of abstraction. In Wix, we can't really add scripts to our website very easily. Do you think that this problem of lack of control due to too much abstraction is there in Spring Boot?
So the difference between, at least from my perspective, between WordPress as opposed to Spring Boot is that Spring Boot does provide a lot of abstraction, but WordPress actually separates the client access to the actual PHP code. Spring Boot is not doing this separation that you cannot have access to it or change things. The only issue here is that there is a big learning curve for you to understand how to change that configuration, which could come as a challenge. And just so yes, this will be my perspective. It is not that it is impossible or that they really restrict you from changing the configuration. Is uh, the issue here is that the point of attraction that they provide to make things simpler for you makes it necessary for you to understand a lot of concepts that are not obvious when you actually need to do your custom work if it's clear.
Hmm. Yes, I agree. It makes sense. So you mentioned that the difference is it's an entire framework where you have to write code and which actually gives you control compared to WordPress, where it just connects you with the PHP code that's already written over there. So,
Mm.
moving ahead, we have some trivia questions for you, which might require a bit of thinking. The first question is, the first question is, so this usually comes to my mind whenever I hear Spring Boot. I imagine a spring under a boot. So, why do you think Spring Boot was named so?
Um, okay, I think the boot for the bootstrapping an application as rapidly as possible, such as with Flask, they try to sell it as the easiest way to build a small application with Python. The Spring, I'm not sure about it, but I think when we imagine a Spring Boot, it's simplifying everything and is a Spring for developers.
Mhm,
The Spring for developers, in my mind, is being able to work with the business logic, with the essence of the application, with the logical side of it, without having to deal with the configuration and without having to worry about boilerplate code that has nothing to do with the actual software engineering or requirement of the project.
mhm.
So I guess is that like the Spring for developers?
I see.
That
That
concept.
makes a lot of sense. More sense than my analogy. Um moving forward, this is a very popular question. So, we had DevOps people over at our community in the past. We also had front end people over at our community, and they all gave different answers to this question. So, considering the fact that Java manages all its dependencies in an XML file known as pom.xml, Java developers tend to have an inclination towards using XML, but you clearly use JSON for the API while building it in Spring Boot. So we are mentioning three data exchange formats: YAML, JSON, and XML. Which one do you prefer using for data exchange? Keep in mind that we can, at this point, use any of these three in any framework because we have the necessary libraries.
Mm, mm, I'll say that Jason. I don't
Okay.
have a strong opinion though, since XML does share the similar a similar structuring in regards to nesting objects. It's just that I'm more used to working with objects in the JSON sense. Not a
Hmm.
strong opinion, actually.
Okay. Hmm. Well, it makes sense because the three formats, all of them you make use of nested key value pairs. So there's not much difference, but I have noticed that DevOps people tend to use YAML more, and front end people like JSON
Nice
more.
thing.
Yes. The next question is, since you have explicitly mentioned that you like developing software that solves social issues, what motivates you to do that?
Mm, when I was back in high school, well, I told you about this in a personal discussion. Well, back in high school, I was a good student just for the sake of having good grades and how that felt, the pride of having good grades. But I did find this inclination towards social issues and towards understanding how I, as an individual, will have the ability to solve those if I could solve those. And actually, when I was a high school student, you often feel that it has to be the government or it have to be certain companies, certain entities, but because you are not in any way equipped with the resources to do anything about it, and you just detach yourself for the issue. However, as I studied in a technical institution, I was having computer science classes and I was having this attachment to social sciences. And I was invited to participate in a competition which require you, that's called the Technovation Challenge. It requires you to build a mobile application that solve an issue in your community. And I realized that if software engineering had to make any sense to me, it will need to be for solving social issues. And it will be my only tool or the only tool that I had to actually do something about the problem without being a powerful company or a powerful government. So that idea
Mm-hmm.
of solving issues that matter to me, in this case, is social, with the skills that I have, which are technical oriented, makes me excited.
Mm-hmm. That's really inspirational, and I think there's a lot to learn from what you just said because most of the time, while struggling in the competition in the engineering world, we forget to have a purpose, which is something we should seek. Moving on, as a software developer who is top rated on Upwork, of course, what do you have to say to fresher engineering students in India?
Mm, what will I advise? What would my advice be for them?
Yes.
Okay, when I have two things. First of all, when you're getting started, it is obvious that everyone will say that Dash is overwhelming and you have so many concepts to learn. Do you usually want to be to use a popular framework such as JavaScript or to simply use Python? Um, I will say start with something really little, with something that you can handle, with what you can handle at the moment, and then try to increment that. Do not try to jump into data science from the very beginning or understand every concept about data science, for example, or do not try to call yourself a software engineer and deal with software engineering without understanding first programming or coding from the basics. On our specifically, I started as a technical assistant, and really I was just doing documentation, just reading technical documentation about Dash projects. And as I was incrementing, I was able to, okay, I can handle documentation. Now I understand the technical documentation of this project. Now I can be a coder, so I can fix issues with CSS or minor issues with databases. Then I was able to solve or develop full modules, and eventually I was able to build applications from scratch. So my advice for you is take what you can handle, but have a pathway of incremental steps that you can take towards that bigger goal, and do not get
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed by that bigger goal. And
Mm-hmm.
my second advice is try to develop. This is something. This could sound cliche, but try to develop a liking a string liking and passion for whatever field you choose, and do not try jumping unless you're exploring, of course. Do not try jumping for motivations that are not internal. So because of money, because of popularity, and this is the software development process, such as with fitness and training. You start doing bodybuilding, doing web training, eating well, and you won't notice any change in the first 5 months. And if you're constantly saying, okay, and I'm losing anyway, you won't see any changes, especially if that's your motivation. But if you continue to keep the right habits, and if you enjoy the process of keeping those right habits, eventually you will see the results. It's the same with software development. It takes a lot of good habits, and at the very beginning, clients will really not recognize the effort that you're putting, or others won't see the effort that you're putting. So just try to develop a liking for it. That's not all.
Mhm. I see. Makes really a lot of sense, especially for the students here at JUET. They tend to have this confusion of whether or not they should continue with a particular technology, depending on whether or not it is trending in the market or whether or not it can get them a job. And oftentimes, it's not really something they should be concerned about. They just get worried by listening to information from here and there and rumors. So I think this advice can greatly help them. Thank you very much. We have one question in the chat by Gustavo, which says, "What do you think of using Spring Boot with Kotlin?" I think we can also use Spring Boot with Groovy.
Yes, we can. Those three.
Mhm.
Um, well, I cannot give a proper response in here, and I won't be subjective. Even though I like Java, I won't be subjective. Um, I do not have any strong opinion with using Kotlin because I don't have experience with Spring Boot and Kotlin specifically. So really not nothing I can say really.
If you get an opportunity to do that, do you think in future you might be inclined to using Kotlin instead of JavaScript?
Um, I was inclined. I won't share my experience with the Spring Boot. I haven't considered Kotlin at the moment. However, when I was working on Android applications, I felt that Kotlin was more efficient or flexible, at least for the syntax, was more direct in that sense, in that regard. And actually, there was an issue with Android Studio and Java, specifically with oh my, I forgot the. Well, there was an issue with Java and Android Studio, and when you read the documentation of Android Studio, you will see that they mostly encourage you to use Kotlin. So at least from my experience with Android Studio, I did have that thought.
I see. Yes, I have definitely noticed that Android developers are continuously being encouraged to use Kotlin instead of Java, especially considering the fact that we can use Kotlin and Java together in a single application, which allows for even more flexibility and easier. It makes it easier for us to move towards Kotlin from Java. And day by day, we are seeing more work in Kotlin for Android applications. So that's really great. We just had a discussion on why Spring Boot was named so. I think Alfio Raymond from the GitHub Education server joined us today, and he mentioned that Spring. So during the nomenclature of the Spring framework, Spring represented a fresh start after the winter, and you already told us that Boot might perhaps refer to bootstrapping, which is clearly what Spring Boot does, as it makes easier for us to develop backend API applications. I think that's it for the Q&A. Thank you very much, Nathaly. It was really nice having you at our community. Please share the presentation and the repository with us. I'll add that to the video description. And it was a lovely live stream. Don't mind the network issues that we had. We have them very often, so we are used to them. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have you at our community again in future. It was really nice having you. Have a good day ahead.
My pleasure. Have a good day.